One of the craziest things happened in fashion recently. Shein has acquired Everlane for $100 million. And I honestly think this might shift the entire business model of the whole fashion industry. Shein is a super ultra fast fashion brand that has come on the scene and has absolutely decimated the market. They are one of the fastest growing fashion brands in the whole world. They are the reason why all the fast fashion brands are scrambling. I talk about this all the time, but Shein is one of the sole reasons why fast fashion brands are completely changing their strategy. If you think of the likes of H&M, for example, H&M for many different years had collaborations dating all the way back to with Karl Lagerfeld, where every single year they would work with a different designer. We've seen H&M collaborate with Margiela. We've seen collaborations with Balmain. But more recently, because of Shein, they've ramped up their strategy because they have to change how they sit in the market. Now, for people that don't understand, even though I've explained this so many times, one of the reasons why Shein sells so well is because of how cheap it is. So before, what we used to consider fast fashion, brands like H&M, brands like Zara, brands like Gap, brands like Next, Topshop, Topman, even though these are fast fashion to varying degrees, they were very much seen as the cheaper clothing options and the more affordable options. Shein has taken their place. So for people that want affordable clothing, most people go to Shein, which is why they make so much money. So they have almost priced out a lot of these legacy fast fashion brands, and they have realized that to survive, they need to rejig and replan their whole structure. That's why H&M, for example, is doing these luxurious runway shows in London, which happened not too long ago. Or you have H&M, for example, having a more luxury line that they're working a lot with, and they put those on runway shows, and they have these massive campaigns. Zara is another huge example. They are trying to sit in the luxury market, kind of where COS is. And COS is a very interesting case study because COS is actually owned by the H&M group, and that was H&M's smart way to have a brand that sits in that mid-level luxury. Not exactly a luxury brand, but also not fast fashion, somewhere in the middle. And that was very smart from them. So Zara is trying to replicate that with Zara Studio that they've been working a lot on and they've been spending a lot of money on. They have also adopted the designer collaboration model. So in recent times, Zara has collaborated with Willy Chavarria. They've collaborated with Ludovic de Saint-Sernin. They've collaborated with Stefano Pilati, who of course is known because he was the creative director of Saint Laurent. You also have Zara recently hiring John Galliano as a designer on their collaborative project. And we did actually eventually see this whole project by John Galliano. The first time we saw it was on the red carpet during the Met Gala. We saw Stevie Nicks wear a Zara dress by John Galliano. On that same red carpet, we saw Bad Bunny wearing Zara. We've also seen now that Bad Bunny is launching a collaborative brand with Zara. So Zara too is scrambling in a way to try and make sure they can properly cement themselves as a mid-level brand, so that they don't have to compete with Shein on price anymore, and they sit in a completely different market segment. So essentially, Shein has changed the industry in that sense. Shein obviously is known for the ultra fast fashion, human rights violations, toxicity in the fabrics. I mean, when clothing is that cheap, what do you expect? Some of the dyes have been tested to be toxic. There are a lot of toxic materials in a lot of the clothing. There are so many studies that we could get into, and I've made videos about this in the past, about how bad Shein is from all angles, whether we talk about the labor angle, whether we talk about the environmental angle. And to be honest, if people want cheap clothing, a good way to get cheap clothing is really just to go secondhand. You can get sensational things on the secondhand market, even luxury brands, things that were made with some of the finest fabrics, but people have just gotten rid of it. Rich people bought it brand new and they just barely wore it, and it's in a charity shop. The charity shop doesn't know the value of that garment, and then you could just buy it for, $5 or something even cheaper than that. So very, very crazy Shein has acquired Everlane, because when you think of Everlane is more considered a sustainable brand. When I think of Everlane is the brand that sort of introduced high levels of transparency when it comes to fashion and running a fashion brand. Everlane was the place where they would tell you how much they paid in the factory, how much to produce a certain item, how much it cost them to ship, how much the retail markup was, how that came to the overall price of an item. They would show you where the clothes came from. They would show you videos on how to make them, on who made them, no markups, none of that BS that you get from all the other brands, right? And this is so anti-fashion to do things in this way, and that's why I think Everlane was very revolutionary, especially when it first started. If you think of that time in about 2011 when Everlane really started picking up steam, it really was, the answer to what millennials were asking for when they were really looking for a brand that was radically transparent. That was what Everlane was. And all the brands at the time, they had to be secretive because they all knew that if their supply chain was, shown, there would be huge issues and they would be exposed for using harmful labor. This is now an issue that we've seen a lot with a lot of luxury brands that produce in Italy, and there have been seen to be, terrible working conditions and people being paid less than the legal minimum wage. And these are the same people making bags that end up costing $3,000 plus at retail. And so Everlane was essentially the brand that had a cult following around being this ethical alternative to fast fashion. It was worn by celebrities. Everyone was talking about it. You had the New York Times writing about the brand. It was, like I said, very transparent. It was seen as sustainable, and it really disrupted the whole industry. In the 2010s, Everlane was flying. Everlane at one point, I think, hit a valuation of around $400 million. And they were opening physical stores in some of the major markets across the world, whether that's San Francisco, New York, or LA. They also expanded into different categories, so you started to see them making things like footwear, outerwear, and accessories. And it really looked like they were on the path to building a $1 billion company. And that's where they were heading. That's where all roads were leading to. But then between 2022 and 2026, Everlane started to struggle for many different reasons. One of the major reasons why Everlane first started to struggle was the customer acquisition cost skyrocketed. And this was because, the likes of Google, Facebook, Instagram, a lot of their advertising rates started to go up because they realized how profitable it was for businesses and that businesses really couldn't survive without that model. So that started to be expensive. You had the likes of Shein and Temu outbidding everyone, of course, and undercutting everyone on price. And no one can really, unless you are literally using slave labor, you can't really compete with those companies, right? And so a brand like Everlane, where their whole brand was about transparency and showing you where things are made and who is making it and how they are made and what the fabrics used are, they just could not compete financially. And so by 2026, everything was looking downhill. They were losing a lot of money rapidly. And it got all the way to a point where they were $90 million in debt. And this is where the Shein acquisition comes in, because they acquired Everlane for $100 million, which is crazy, right? This is a brand that was, Everlane I'm talking about, was a brand that was $400 million in evaluation, and people thought it was going to be projected to be a $1 billion brand. And fast forward all these years later, they're $90 million in debt and they're being acquired for $100 million, which is a fraction of the value that it once was. But what I really want to talk about, and I haven't really seen a lot of people, whether on YouTube or TikTok, Instagram, talk about why it makes sense for Shein to acquire Everlane. And I have many different reasons, some more obvious, some less obvious. The most obvious reason, of course, is data. Shein is a brand that is used to selling very cheap products to customers, and they aren't super transparent. They are acquiring a brand that operates in a completely opposite way to them. So just by having all of that data, they could learn so much that could make them so much more money in the future, right? You guys know in this digital age how important data is, how much people can make selling other people's data. This is a very, very known thing that happens. So it doesn't surprise me that Shein would want to acquire it for those reasons. Another thing is that when you think about it, Shein doesn't need a lower customer base in the sense of customers that will spend cheap prices or spend not a lot of money on clothing. They already own all those customers. They have all those customers. They've acquired all those customers. But I think Where Everlane comes in is learning about their infrastructure, but also IPO positioning, and even it might help them in the future with certain governments. And I'll tell you what I mean. In the car industry, there are a lot of car companies that didn't want to make electric cars at first, but a lot of governments started to put laws in place where you had to have a certain amount of cars that you produce that were considered green, in this case electric cars. And if you weren't within a certain threshold, you had to partner with a different company to make sure that you get those credits from having a certain number of green cars, right? In fashion, these kind of laws are starting to be implemented where if your supply chain is seen to be very harmful to certain economies, there's a certain parameter that you have to hit. And with Shein acquiring Everlane, all of Everlane's sales can be those credits for those green sales that they can then use. So that way they can get away with producing Shein clothing in the toxic way that they do, because they can lean on different brands that they acquire that give them green credits. So I think from a business standpoint, not that I agree with this acquisition, but from a business standpoint, I think that's actually really smart. Especially because you think about all the structural headwinds that Shein has been going through recently. For example, last year, Shein, I believe, did $38 billion in revenue, which is insane. That's more revenue than almost every single luxury brand in the whole industry, if not every single one, which is insane. But their growth is hitting saturation because governments, especially Western governments, have been fighting strongly against Shein. A big thing that we talk about in the fashion industry is how in the USA, for example, they clamped the de minimis exemption to make sure that Shein is not able to take advantage of that. For people that don't really know what this thing was, because in May 2025, the USA essentially changed the rules around their de minimis tax exemption. Why did they do this? Because Shein was taking advantage of it. So it just meant that essentially if you were shipping orders to the US under $800, you wouldn't have to pay tariffs, right? You were exempt from certain tariffs. So what Shein used to do, they used to just send a bunch of separate orders to the USA that were all under $800. That way they wouldn't have to pay tariffs. So the USA started to realize that their market and their economy was being flooded with all these cheap products that were undercutting their own companies, the fashion companies in the US, and causing, fashion companies in the US to struggle. So that's why they changed the rules around it. And so now every single parcel that Shein sends in faces an automatic 30% tariff on arrival. And so that means that the Shein dress that used to cost $5 to ship without any, tariffs, now it's going to have that extra 30%. So in this case would be an extra around $1.50. And the outcome of all of this meant that Shein's net profit were reduced drastically and they fell by 40%. So even though by a lot of metrics, Shein really is the biggest fashion retailer in the world just by revenue, 38 billion is absolutely insane. Because of their net profit drop, even though they're making significantly more revenue now, their net profit had fallen to $1 billion, even though there was a 19% increase in sales. And so these businesses, they know that these issues are happening, and they need to find very creative ways to overcome these structural and business model problems. So of course, we've been talking a lot about America and the de minimis tax exemption, but let's talk about Europe and what Europe is doing to fight back against Shein. So Shein used to take advantage of a duty-free tax exemption in the EU, which meant that parcels that were less than 150 euros were exempt from tax. They realized, just like the USA, that Shein, because their shipments are so low in cost, a lot of them were falling under this 150 euro exemption. Therefore, the market was being flooded with Shein products, which meant they were undercutting a lot of the competitors from their own nations in price, which meant that they were causing a lot of local brands to struggle. So what did the EU do? They changed the law so there's no exemption for them. So now every single small parcel that enters the EU has to face a mandatory €3 tariff charge, essentially. And then on top of that, they then have to pay whatever extra VAT and customs duties are levied, depending on where it's coming from, the size of the parcel, the weight, all these different things, like what fabric is made of, so many different factors, right? And even there are individual countries in the EU that are clamping even harder on Shein. For example, France has a €5 tax on ultra fast fashion goods, which of course is specifically targeting Shein. And France is also saying that by 2030, it's going to rise to €10 per item coming from these ultra fast fashion brands. So of course they're making sure that their own French brands and, cheaper French brands can compete against Shein. And so all of this to say, as a company, what do you do when you can't really grow because every single country is putting legislation against your brand, whether that's the USA, whether that's in the EU? You acquire a brand that's known for sustainability, a brand that's transparent, a brand that operates in a way that the USA and the EU isn't fighting against structurally, and you integrate that into the makeup of your main brand using data and information that you've learned from the way that Everlane was profitable all those years that they were, and you mix it with your own know-how of how you're profitable as a company. Another big thing about the way Shein operates that I'm surprised no one is talking about this is Shein launched something recently called the Accelerator Program. What this Accelerator Program is, and you can even find it on their website, and you can see the brands that have signed up to this program, it's essentially Shein giving other brands access to their supply chain. And why is this super important? One of the reasons why so many companies and brands cannot compete with Shein is because Shein has the infrastructure to bring stuff from factory to market in 5 to 7 days, which was never done before. Fast fashion, sometimes it would take weeks, sometimes months, but that was still rapid back then. So if something is popular, if something is trending on TikTok, you would have Zara and H&M and all these other companies, it would take them weeks to bring it to market, where Shein could bring it to market in 5 days, sometimes even 4 days. And with that amount of speed, by the time other companies are able to produce these items, people have already bought everything they want to buy from Shein, right? So this was a big reason why a lot of companies were struggling to fight against Shein. And Shein knows this, so they launched this accelerator program, and it's essentially the only alternative to not signing up to this accelerator program, especially if you're a fast fashion brand, is to compete against Shein, and you won't win. So Shein have managed to get money because their items are so cheap. So everyone is going to Shein because of the price. That's affordable for a lot of people. Then they have money coming in from all these brands that know they can't compete with Shein. So they will pay Shein to use their infrastructure and their supply chain, which is absolutely insane. But when you think of a brand like Everlane that they've acquired, it's completely different because Everlane does not really operate in a way that it would be useful to sign up to the Shein Accelerator Program. And I honestly think as time progresses and as many fast fashion brands can't compete, of course you have the likes of H&M and Zara that are fighting against it. You also have the likes of Gap and what they're doing with Gap Studio, and they have designers like Zach Posen that are involved really trying to build the branding of Gap as a brand. But there will be a lot of fast fashion brands that cannot compete, and they will just join the accelerator program because it's like, if you can't beat them, join them. We've seen companies like Misguided, for example. They are already part of the Shein accelerator program. And the last point I want to make that is really important when it comes to this acquisition of Everlane from Shein, you need to think about Shein wanting to IPO. For people that don't know, because I know not all of you follow these stories, but essentially Shein has been trying to IPO for quite a few years. They've been blocked by a lot of governments. The USA have blocked them trying to IPO. But essentially, there was a point in time when people were talking about if Shein IPO'd, they could essentially raise $90 billion. But with all these legislative, we can call it, roadblocks that are in the way of Shein and the way they operate, over time, the value of Shein has been going down slowly and slowly. Once again, even though their revenue is higher and their profit is higher, people can't see the same rate of growth that they once had. So Shein isn't seen as valuable as it once was, right? So why Everlane is important for Shein is because with learnings that they get from Shein and by weaving the infrastructure that Everlane uses into the way that Shein operates, there might be less legislative roadblocks from these companies, and they might finally be able to IPO. And I think a big way that Shein can IPO in a lot of these markets is to diversify their portfolio. I think because it's just Shein and Shein, these governments are fighting so hard against Shein because Shein will literally decimate the fashion industry in many different countries. And a lot of these countries, their main concern is with Shein. The problem with Shein is that they make all this money and then the infrastructure is spent in China. So they collect all this benefit from all these Western countries financially, and then they reinvest in infrastructure in China instead of these countries where they are gaining these mass amounts of profits. That's the reason why these governments don't like the way that Shein operates, because they don't get a piece of the pie. Politics. With them diversifying their portfolio with brands that are more Western based, with brands that, you know, the government are in support of operating in their country, I think that's a way that they can soften the government's hold and fight against the company, and that way they can start to make different moves. So yeah, I think for so many different reasons, this Everlane acquisition makes so much sense. Shein is a huge company. They have loads of money to hire the best business analysts. They're not going to spend $100 million on a brand if they don't think that there is a lot to gain. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. This is a big reason why Everlane has been acquired by Shein. Of course, it is crazy that an ultra fast fashion brand is acquiring a sustainable brand, but as I've explained, there are many different business realities for why this has happened. But yeah, on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you want even deeper analysis and different videos that aren't available on YouTube or that I just can't post on YouTube, definitely consider joining as a YouTube channel member or on the Patreon. And if you like videos like this and you want to support the channel, please like the video and of course leave a hype for the video. That really helps me out. I really want to know in the comments what you guys think about Shein acquiring Everlane and what you think this is going to do for the fashion industry at large. I'd like to know your thoughts, and without further ado, I'll be back with another video very soon.